Alright, hello everyone, I'm Michael, I'm from Aspire, and this is going to be a brief overview on shock in the body. Alright, now when you hear shock, you're going to mostly have to remember that shock is basically a lack of oxygen to the tissues. Now when this occurs, you're going to have multiple problems with the body. It can lead to organ failure and eventually death if it's not treated. Now shock goes into three different main categories. You have cardiogenic, you have hypovolemic, and you have septic shock. Let's begin with cardiogenic shock right here. This is going to occur in three different ways. One of these have to do with hypovolemic, which you're going to have a lack of fluid in the body, or a lack of blood for whatever reason, and this is going to mean that even though the heart's working properly, it's not going to be able to get enough blood into the organs, so the organs aren't going to get enough oxygen that it needs, and that's going to put the patient into shock. Another form of cardiogenic shock is cardiogenic shock, which means that the heart isn't working properly. It's going to occur for multiple reasons. One common one is that you have a faulty valve, which means that enough blood flow isn't being pumped out of the heart. You're not having enough blood pressure into the heart through the organs, which means you're not getting enough oxygen to the organs that they need. Another one, you can have an obstruction, so going out into the arteries or a different part of the body, you can have an obstruction which is causing a lack of blood flow to different parts of the body. Depending on how severe the obstruction is, you can put the patient to shock through that way. You can also have distributive, which means that these arteries are throughout the body, they're starting to dilate due to one reason or another, but the main thing to remember from this is that due to dilation, you're going to have a decreased blood flow, which means that you're not going to have the proper amount of oxygen once again going throughout the body. Now, for cardiogenic shock, you're going to have a decreased cardiac output. You're also going to have either increased heart rate or a decreased heart rate, depending on what exactly is occurring. If there's an obstruction, the heart's going to try to compensate by pumping harder. If there's no fluid, then the heart rate's going to also increase. In some cases, it does decrease, such as during a cardiogenic problem with the heart. And also, for all of these, the blood pressure is going to decrease. The skin temperature, if you look at the person who's going through this, many times they're going to look a bit palish blue. It's because they're losing oxygen, they're not having enough oxygen throughout their body. And so a lot of the tissue is beginning to die, which is why they're pale and why they're a little colder than usual. That brings us to hypervolemic, as we mentioned before. Now, hypervolemic shock, you're going in with the fluid. You're dealing with the body fluid. Now, the most common of this is trauma. So it can either be due to trauma. Let's say you have a car accident, a person loses a good amount of blood, and because of this, they go into shock. There's not enough volume in their system to be able to give sufficient amount of blood oxygen-enriched blood into the body. Now, this isn't the only way that someone can lose a lot of fluid. Other ways you can have severe vomiting, severe diarrhea, severe sweating even, can drop the fluid levels below a certain point, and then the person will go into hypervolemic shock, which will go through the same symptoms as before. You're going to have a decreased cardiac output due to this, the lack of blood inside the body. You're going to also have an increased heart rate as a compensation, but even though you have an increased heart rate, the blood pressure is still going to drop. And once again, because there is a lack of oxygen, you're starting to have a lot of death of tissues, not enough blood's going through the body, so you're going to have a drop of temperature. Which finally brings us to septic shock, which is our final type of shock. Septic shock, you have to think infections. Now, this is a term you're going to hear a lot in hospitals, sepsis. Now, this is going to occur with bacterial, it can occur with viral, it can occur with multiple types of infection. Usually it occurs with bacterial infections. Now, what's occurring during septic shock? It begins with sepsis, the initial infection. So after sepsis, you're going to have the inflammatory response. A lot of your body is going to have some inflammation. It's going to have that inflammatory response due to your immune system reacting to the infection. Now, the problem with that is that eventually you're going to have severe sepsis, which is, at this point, the inflammation is starting to create a problem. You're not going to have sufficient blood flow once again throughout the body. And once you have severe sepsis, it's not too long until you get to septic shock, which is what we're talking about. Now, septic shock is when there's not enough blood going into the organs at this point. You're starting to have organ failure. This is when you see kidneys shut down. This is when you see respiratory failure. And at this point, you have an increased cardiac output. You have an increased heart rate, all trying to compensate, all trying to react due to the immune system trying to fight off an infection. You also have your blood pressure starts to drop. There's not enough blood flow going through due to the inflammation process. And once again, since this is an infection, you're going to have your skin temperature rise. It's the only one where your skin temperature is going to rise. Because the person is fighting off an infection, there's increased activity in the body. And due to this, you're not going to have the same symptoms in the patient, but they're also going to breathe heavily, and it's going to be noticeable. Their BP is going to drop. And those are all indicators of septic shock, which can be told by bacterial culture to see if the person does have an infection. This is a brief overview of the three main types of shock. This graph is pretty important to remember. If you remember this, it's a lot easier to kind of get a feel for how shock works and what different types there are and the different functions of it, which once again, there's all types of things to know for the different compensations. But for now, we'll just leave it at this. It's a brief overview of shock.